Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. Thanks for joining us today. My name's John Williams. I'm the chair of PilieroMazza's Government Contracts Practice Group. And in our GovCon group here at the firm, we thought, what better way to kick off the new year than talking about the National Defense Authorization Act, or as we like to call it, the NDAA. So every year, this is must-pass legislation, and they cram it chock full of new provisions that shape federal procurement and impact contractors in the new year and beyond. And in the 2022 NDAA, it's no different. So the goal of this webinar is to give you a good overview of what's in this 2022 NDAA and how's that going to impact you as a federal contractor in the year ahead. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items for you. All of the attendees are going to get a recording of this webinar via email after the webinar's over, and it'll also be posted on our YouTube channel. And we're encouraging everybody to submit questions. So please use that question box in the program and fire away all your questions throughout. We'll answer as many as we can as we move along. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers for today's webinar, Kevin Barnett and Elizabeth Sullivan. Kevin, as you can see here up on your screen, is counsel in our government contracts group at PilieroMazza, and he advises contractors on a wide range of issues. He has a focus on claims and REAs and appeals work, which we've really seen a significant growth in over the last few years. He's also our Freedom of Information Act guru. So when you have FOIA issues, Kevin's your guy. And he's really a Swiss Army knife. I mean, he's really very adept at solving a host of different FAR compliance matters for our clients. And as I mentioned, Kevin and I are both in our government contracts group at PilieroMazza. So as you see the next slide loading up here, you'll get a sense of the other practice areas that we handle beyond government contracting. We're a business law firm. We have clients that are government contractors and commercial businesses all around the country in a variety of industries. So if you're new to PilieroMazza, please don't hesitate to reach out to Kevin or to me or visit us on the web to learn more about us. Our other speaker today is Elizabeth Sullivan, who's the president of Madison Services Group. We're so glad to have Lizzie with us today. Thank you. Lizzie and Madison Services are longtime friends of our firm and are super strong advocates for federal procurement and small business issues. So we work often with Madison Services on the types of issues that we're going to talk about today. What provisions are in the 2022 NDAA. They're going to shape procurement going forward. Lizzie currently leads the policy teams for the California Association for Micro Enterprise Opportunity, the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce, the HubZone Contractors National Council, and a group of small and mid-sized IT value-added resellers. She's also very experienced with supply chain and cybersecurity issues and just an all-around dynamo when it comes to government procurement and legislative sausage making. So with that intro, Lizzie, would you please come on mic and tell us a little bit about Madison Services?
Thanks so much, John. Appreciate that introduction. Well, you summed us up pretty well. As John said, we're a boutique lobbying firm, and our sausage making is really in small business and government contracting. Some of you may know our founder, Ann Sullivan. She worked to put together the WOSB program and put that in place for 11 years. So we've been around for quite a while. Our clients, as John mentioned, are both organizations and also individual businesses. We also represent the Women Veterans Business Coalition and recently launched Secure Supply Chain Consortium. In this capacity, we both execute top-tier advocacy strategies and, look to elevate our clients and their members. For individual companies, we have a few that we represent, and we assist those with acquisition strategy and elevating their profiles to make them more successful in the GovCon space. I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about something we work on every year, the NDAA. Thanks again, Piliero. You all are a fantastic partner and really help with our advocacy efforts. So thanks so much for having me today. Kevin,
Thanks,
you want to
Lizzie.
kick? Awesome.
Yeah, so we're here today, obviously, to talk about the FY22 NDAA. And as John mentioned, that's the annual Defense Department authorization bill. And it's a extremely thick bill that's just chock full of authorizing different Defense Department programs, allowing the department to spend all of their appropriated money, and also, you know, they slip in or pack in, or however you want to phrase it, as much policy and as they can muster. And each year, it's really the primary way that government contract policy is changed on the Hill. One reason for that is that it has been reliably passed each year for the last 60 years, making it one of the few bills that you can expect will be passed each and every year. I mean, frankly, it's more reliable than the budget, which most years goes without passage these days. This year's bill was a little bit of a roller coaster. Originally, it was the House passed a version, HR 4350, and when it was sent over to the Senate, it got caught up in Senate politics. As a result, the two houses needed to scramble, and instead of a compromise bill in the normal course, they were able to amend an existing piece of unrelated legislation to keep their 60-plus year streak alive. And on December 27th, President Biden signed it into law, authorizing over $700 billion in DoD funding, and enacting a number of federal procurement policy changes that we're going to talk about. Lizzie, what's the normal way that the NDA gets passed? What's the normal order?
Before we talk about that, I do want to note, as Kevin said, there are procurement policy changes in this bill, right? But actually, small business provisions haven't always been in there. The reason was because it has to be germane, right, to the bill. So it has to make sense to go into the bill and relate to defense. So something that was dreamt up a while ago was that, you know, the defense industrial base needs to be strong. That includes small business, and thus now we have, you know, an expected small business section. But I always find that very interesting that, you know, it hasn't always been in there. But yeah, talking about regular order on the next slide, usually, as Kevin said, this process for the past 60 years has gone a little bit something like this. First, there are hearings in both the House and Senate on programs for the upcoming National Defense Authorization Act. And each of those committees have subcommittees that you can find on their websites. It's like armedservices.house.gov and armedservices.senate.gov, I think. And they each have their own jurisdiction and things that they, you know, want to see in the bill. And they actually work on these things mostly in tandem, as in they're doing them both, you know, kind of at the same time in their own versions. Then full committee hearings happen in both HASC and SASC, if you want to use those policy terms, in both committees. Eventually, the committees work to pass them out of the committee, and then both the full House considers their own version of the National Defense Authorization Act, makes amendments, which is really a crucial process from a policy standpoint. This is sometimes where a lot of the small business provisions make their way into the bill because a lot of the times it doesn't make sense to put them in the underlying bill. So the amendment process is actually really important with respect to, you know, small business GovCon policy. And then the Senate is supposed to go through the same process for its version. Then both the House and Senate have their two versions, and they do a conference where they appoint members and staffers to kind of resolve the differences between the two versions of the bills. And then they produce a final report that is actually the final bill, but it's called a report of the National Defense Authorization Act that goes to the president for his signature. But as Kevin said, wasn't really regular order. There were some disagreements in the Senate over a Nord 2 pipeline that Senator Cruz wanted, something else that Senator Rubio from Florida wanted. Therefore, the Senate couldn't come up with their own version to pass. And thus, also, as Kevin mentioned, members and staff kind of did a behind the scenes informal conference to come up with a compromise version that both of them could pass into law. And as Kevin said, keeping that streak for a 61st year. So that's kind of usually what happens, and usually what we start to see. This process, by the way, is really a whole year process, and something for the FY 2023 NDAA we are actually starting to talk about with the Hill now.
So this year we took a look at the bill and identified these 3 themes as being the ones that are really going to impact government contractors the most as a whole, and in particular small businesses. But these 3 themes are by no means exhaustive. I mean, it's a 910-page bill that includes a significant number of new policies. The ones that we're going to talk about, go ahead.
I was going to say, would you say these policies are new, or have we seen them before? Kind of what are your thoughts having looked over many pages of this bill and coming up with these?
When I was a young government contract lawyer, I heard the phrase that what's old is new again in government contracts. And that is certainly true this year, although it might even be the case that what's new is new again, because these are themes that we've seen throughout, government contract policy in general the past couple of years. Mm-hmm. The domestic preferences and supply chain protection, that was a priority of the Trump administration and has continued to be a priority of the Biden administration. We've seen copies, we've seen provisions in the last several NDAAs dealing with, supply chain issues. I think everyone on this call, is familiar with, Section 889, and all the compliance issues that come with that. Small businesses is it was very interesting, Lizzie, you mentioning how that got put into this bill, because I think of it as such a key portion and is one of the first parts of the bill that I look at each year.
Absolutely.
And as well as, the government wants to buy technology in an easier way. That's a story we've been hearing since, probably the Reagan administration or earlier. So these are not new. These are not new themes, but this year's take on them.
Got it. I love that what's old is new again. I think that's very applicable to these for sure.
Absolutely. And there are some other themes that I think we could have pulled out but didn't. Cybersecurity played a big role in this year's NDAA, except as I read most of those provisions, it was DOD and the government trying to get their house in order. Yep. And although there were some very significant cybersecurity provisions that were discussed as potentially in the NDAA, I don't think there were any that were, real game changers for contractors yet.
That's good to know, because as you referenced Section 889 from, what was that, the FY19 NDAA, FY18, FY19, that was just a little provision. Section 889 is what it was, right? That had enormous implications, as most people on the phone know, for contractors, for government. I mean, it was a huge deal and was maybe, a few sentences. So very important as a government contractor to know what's in this bill, because something that could seem like an unassuming provision actually could have a huge implication on, your business, your customers. So good to know on the cyber side for that portion for this year, Kevin.
Yeah, but you talked about Section 889. Let's start digging into what kind of supply chain and domestic preference provisions are in this year's bill. I highlighted a number of them in our presentation that jumped out at me. The first is Section 802. It prohibits the Department of Defense from procuring PPE. Strange world we live in. That was not a common acronym, 2.5 years ago, but I don't even think we need to define it now. The provision prohibits DoD from procuring PPE from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And the provision, applies to anything that could be considered PPE, masks and gloves and sanitizing wipes and face shields. It takes a very broad brush there. Interestingly, there are 3 exceptions. If it's not available in satisfactory quantities or quality, if it's for use outside of the US, or if it's for purchases below $150,000. Well, I understand, this is very consistent with a lot of provisions we've been seeing. We want to buy products that are produced domestically. We don't want to rely on China or Russia or these other adverse countries for these very important supplies. The Congressional Research Service released a report, I think last December, or maybe a year ago December, talking about how poor the domestic production of PPE is. For example, nitrile gloves. There's almost no domestic production of nitrile gloves, and it almost all comes from China, except under this provision, without a waiver, you're not going to be able to purchase that kind of product, or DoD is not going to be able to purchase that kind of product. So I think this broad, I think this broad provision is going to lead to a lot of waivers in the short term or unnecessarily small purchases. Although I would note that the section specifically calls out DoD, and it is not a government-wide prohibition. So from my take on it, the VA or HHS, who are huge purchasers of PPE, would not be affected by this.
Yeah, I'm really interested, as you said, in how this is going to work with, a lot of the KN95s I saw that the House members were using on the, the House floor, were technically from China, but it was procured by, a different company that was outside of those. So yeah, kind of how this is going to roll out in government, I think will be very interesting.
Another provision that I thought was interesting, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but the Xinjiang-Uyghur prohibition. So that's the autonomous region in China, and there's a number of complaints about human rights abuses and forced labor camps. You may recall a few years ago, Disney filmed part of their live action Mulan there, and there were talks about boycotting the movie because of it. So the NDAA provision prohibits using appropriated funds to procure any product that was mined, produced, or manufactured wholly or in part by forced labor in this region. What I found possibly most interesting about this provision, though, is usually the NDAA is leading the implementation of social policy or of government policy choices or changes. And in this case, the NDAA kind of fell behind its counterpart, where before the NDAA was enacted, a broader ban on imports from this region was passed and signed a few days before the NDAA went into effect, or was signed by the president. So I thought that was interesting. We have a question here that I'm trying to read, so I apologize.
It says, who are you reporting to on these? The government contracting officer or different government agency, or is this something we will see as part of the implementation process? Do you know the answer to that right now, or is that something we have to look into? I think she's referring to the PPE prohibition.
Yeah, I think the PPE prohibition we'll see how that works as far as the implementation process. But it's a broad ban on using appropriated funds. So I think you're just going to see a lack of solicitations or some sole source small purchases to try and get around to this ban to the extent that the government needs to purchase PPE and it's not available otherwise.
Ah, sorry, got it. And she said that she meant the China disclosure requirements. Thank you for the clarification.
Oh, yeah, we'll get to those in a few minutes. Section 851, this may bring back some PTSD from, it's very similar to Section 889. Section 851 modifies some restrictions on the procurement of printed circuit boards that was enacted in last year's NDAA, fiscal year 21. And it basically did two things. One, it clarified what types of products could not include Chinese or Russian or North Korean or Iranian printed circuit boards, and limiting it to, prohibiting it from being included in defense security systems or systems that are identified as national security sensitive in the contract. So that provided some clarity to the broad provision that was in last year's bill. But also, I think, to the relief of a lot of individuals, a lot of companies and contractors whose products use printed circuit boards primarily from China, they pushed back this requirement from 2023 until 2027 to give people a longer ramp up to figure out their supply chain.
I know that this was actually a concern, as you mentioned, for a lot of larger tech companies and thus for, small businesses that are IT resellers specifically, because, a lot of the circuit boards were, there was going to be a shortage and a lot of the larger companies were saying things couldn't be made in a certain way to comply with this. So I know that if that's an industry you're in, this is something that you should keep an eye on, also with your larger customers.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the new requirements as well is DoD is required to do some rulemaking to flesh out some exceptions for certain commercial item contractors, which hopefully will alleviate some of these small business IT resellers from falling within these prohibitions.
We'll definitely be watching for those.
Section 847 is Congress instructed DoD to develop and implement a plan that's going to reduce the country's reliance on services, supplies, materials from those same big four countries, China, North Korea, Russia, or Iran. I tried to stay away from flagging a lot of these different provisions that required reports or briefings or plans, because those aren't what's going to be impacting us in the short term. But I think the writing is very clearly on the wall with this provision, as well as another provision tucked into Section 5502 that requires DoD to develop a list of contractors who may have participated in cyber attacks or conducted surveillance against the United States, that more supply chain restrictions are coming down the pipe. Excuse me. More Huawei ban type provisions, more Section 889 type provisions, and those I think those are going to start covering a lot more contractors and a lot more, key components to the supply chain that's going to cause disruptions in the coming years. And I think this is them laying the groundwork for passing those more restrictive provisions. Again, keeping with the theme of, China, really, I think these provisions have that in common more than anything else. There's a new reporting requirement that contractors are required to report as part of their proposal if any contract above $5 million is going to be performed in any part in China. And if so, the contractor is required to provide, detailed information about exactly where in China and under what circumstances the individual or individuals are going to be performing the contract over there. And there's a very clear prohibition that DoD cannot award a contract or renew a contract to any contractor that fails to make this disclosure.
Wow.
So that's a lot of teeth to put behind this disclosure requirement.
That is a lot of teeth. And it seems like, and I was kind of thinking of two different questions for you, but you answered them along the way around, kind of compliance and what that looks like, but also, how this fits into that larger federal government focus on, Buy American and domestic preferences, which you referenced earlier, has really spanned between both administrations, a Republican to a Democrat, but then also, this is a bipartisan bill. So these provisions were signed off on by both parties. So it seems like this is something that we'll probably continue to see in future NDAAs and in, kind of talking about domestic preferences. Don't you think so?
Oh, absolutely. And then I think if I didn't answer the question explicitly, this is circling back to the question from a little bit earlier, is the disclosure requirements will need to be made as part of the proposal process.
Right.
I'm not sure how they'll handle it, whether it'll be some type of representation or, just a requirement to include it in your proposal. But it goes into effect July 1st. So we do have a few months to figure out how it's going to work.
So talking about small business and the amendments that were specifically in that section of the NDAA, I just wanted to highlight 3 of them that made it into the bill. The first one, if there are any hub zone businesses on the phone, this is something, that directly impacts you. Section 864, we actually represent the Hub Zone Contractors National Council, as John mentioned in the beginning, and worked on this amendment on their behalf. So we're really excited to see it in the final bill. What it does is it transfers the final decision-making power of protested hub zone small business status of a small business from the existing, SBA Office of Government Contracting to now the SBA Office of Hearings and Appeals, or OHA. This is something that, we thought was important to bring parity to the program, since this is where other things are decided for the other socioeconomic programs, but also because, if you're having an issue and then it's going to the same office that told you that you're no longer a hub zone, it didn't seem to be very subjective, right? So this is something that we're excited to see. The enactment period for this is within 1 year of when the bill was signed into law. So we should see that sometime in December of this year. SBA is going to issue a rule, authorizing OHA to do this for hub zones. And I'd love to know from either, Kevin or John, on the legal side, how do you think this will change the process for hub zone businesses? Because I know you all practice in this area and deal with these issues for your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in on that. And I think it'll be really helpful that we will have precedent from the administrative law judges at the Office of Hearings and Appeals, on how the rules should be interpreted and applied. I think the small business rules, each of the different programs, they have their own complexities and challenges in interpreting. I think the HUBZone rules in general tend to be some of the more complicated or difficult to follow for contractors and for us too, in trying to advise contractors. And there've been a lot of guidance over the last year or so from SBA in the form of FAQs that have clarified the rules in some respects, and in other respects maybe contributed to making it difficult for HUBZone firms to track on what they need to be doing. So having cases start to develop on how the judges say the rules need to be interpreted, I think will be very beneficial for HUBZone firms. I think it'll be beneficial for SBA too, because they may realize they need to make some changes to their rules if the judges say that maybe the rules, as written, are interpreted a little bit differently than maybe even SBA would expect. So I think for everybody involved, I think this will be a great and impactful change.
Got it. That's fantastic to hear. That was one, again, that we were thrilled to see in the bill, and and I know Piliero will also, be monitoring when that comes out of SBA. Next section we wanted to talk about is Section 866, which is a report on the DoD's Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. Before we dive into what was in this amendment, I just want to give a little background on this issue and why it is important for contractors, not just DoD contractors, all contractors. As some of you may know on this call, this CMMC in its first iteration was really full steam ahead throughout the pandemic and pre-pandemic for the past couple years. The idea being that there wasn't a robust kind of cyber certification or cyber compliance amongst DoD contractors, and that needed to change. That a lot of companies weren't really cyber secure, and that with increased amount of breaches and cyber attacks and ransomware attacks, that something needed to be done. So CMMC was actually something that DoD decided to do by itself. It wasn't actually something that Congress directly told DoD to do, which is important to know because then that kind of caused some funding issues. But basically what happened was, as I said, full steam ahead. One of the things that we saw missing in combos with the Defense Department when they were looking for industry feedback was the input of small businesses, which make up a huge amount of DoD contractors, and as we mentioned before, the defense industrial base. So what we did is we started the drumbeat of talking about the importance of small business and getting small business contractor and frankly mid-sized contractors input in this issue. No one was saying that cybersecurity isn't needed for small business, just that honestly small contractors need to be part of the conversation. Through our Secure Supply Chain Consortium, we worked on different language and appropriations bills and starting some oversight by GAO, who came out with a really great report. And this past summer kind of culminated in a House Small Business Committee hearing on CMMC and the impact on small business. And I would encourage anyone who is a contractor that wants to know more about this issue to take a look at that hearing. And that would be on, I believe it's smallbusiness.house.gov, and they have a tab for hearings. But it just kind of highlighted a bunch of the issues that we've been hearing from every type of small business contractor. And frankly, when the DoD adopts something, usually civilian agencies start to adopt it, right? There were some CMMC requirements kind of sneaking into some GSA vehicles, kind of teeing up for the future. So again, DoD contractor or not, this is something you should be paying attention to. during the hearing, a couple of the issues that were kind of front and center were cost of compliance. We've heard things all over the board, the way information was shared about this initiative and some other things. And as a result, this provision, Section 866, really is kind of putting the screws to DoD to make them put in writing some of the things that, we highlighted in the hearing. So what this amendment requires is DoD to submit a report on the impact of CMMC on small business within 120 days of when, the NDAA was signed into law. So that's not too far away. The report has to include an estimated cost burden for each CMMC level, the anticipated decrease in the number of small businesses as a result of CMMC, which is really important because one of the things that we've been trying to tackle through our advocacy is the decline of small businesses and the number of small businesses, not dollars, but the number of small businesses in the federal marketplace. And this was certainly contributing to that. And then how the DoD plans to mitigate the negative effects to small business resulting from CMMC. The report's also going to expand reporting requirements on information for training on small businesses, on assessment compliance, which is important with the 2.0 model that came out, efforts to work with non-traditional companies, and a plan for oversight of third-party assessors. And this was actually the final section was a modified version during that compromise, kind of backroom compromise we talked about that actually expanded the components. So both the Senate and the House are really, interested in this. And while you may think it's just a report, it's actually really important, information and data. And again, forces DoD to really put out these things to the public. And we're excited to see kind of what comes of that. So that was Section 866.
So Lizzie, on that, if I could, so do you expect that this report on CMMC will it be a report about CMMC 2.0? Because we're starting to see, within the last maybe it's been a couple months now, but relatively recently, we're moving on to CMMC 2.0. So is that what they'll be studying, I guess, or what do you think?
Yeah, so it was interesting the timing that 2.0 was rolled out, and then when this went into effect. But that is the idea, is that this is about 2.0 since 1.0 is no longer happening. So that cost burden, though, I think that DoD will probably look at or I'm hoping they look at, and we will be having Congress ask them to look at is, what were the impacts of third-party assessment or getting ready for that, right? Like what's the compliance for what was a level 1 that's still kind of a level 1. But yeah, it should be on the 2.0 version. Last section is around size determination reporting requirement. What it does is it's requiring that a status of a company to be updated in the system award management, or SAM, when a final decision is made on, whether or not a small business or socioeconomic status is, no longer in effect, right? So if you're no longer a hub zone, you need to put into SAM once a final decision is made that you are no longer a hub zone, and it requires companies to notify contracting officers for which they have pending bids on the contracts where they have lost such status. This came out of, Congress is always looking for how can they mitigate fraud and abuse. GAO does reports on every program, and every program, of course, is bound to have some fraud and abuse. So this was a way that they thought they could, mitigate some of that by putting the onus on the company to update their status in SAM if they are no longer qualified as a, SCVSB, women-owned 8A hub zone, small business.
Lizzie, to clarify on that, that's after OHA makes a final determination. It's if there was a SLIDES protest or some kind of challenge to the language in the bill is not particularly clear. You have to track it back to the actual statute, which, they amend the language in that OHA final determination section.
Yeah, so that's correct.
I've had a couple of questions already about people thinking it's now a 2-day reporting requirement just across the board.
No. Well, that is a good thing to note, and I will make sure to note that when we're talking about this. But yes, that is related to a final decision via OHA. And I think that's all, around, unless you had any other questions on these around kind of the small business sections of the bill.
Yeah. Moving on to, simplifying the procurement of innovative technology. Tell me if you've heard this before. DoD doesn't think that they are able to purchase innovative technology or procure it fast enough. And so they need new mechanisms to cut through their own red tape. This was the problem that led to initial creation of other transaction authorities decades ago. And the problem is still here. In particular, the issue is that for decades, DoD was the innovator and the commercial sector followed. That's how we got the internet. That's how we got Velcro. Now the process is very much reversed. The commercial sector is where all the innovation is occurring. And DoD continuously seeks a way to, catch up so that they get, they get the 2000s best technology in the 2000s, instead of it coming to them a decade or 15 years later. And despite all their efforts and all the different ways they've tried, I guess they're still at the drawing board. I think if you look in the Senate Armed Services Committee report on one of the prior versions, they even point to the fact, that this is somewhat of a cultural issue, that they find DoD is too often choosing custom solutions, because they feel like they know that type of cost reimbursable contracting path, as opposed to buying commercial off-the-shelf technology that will fit what they need. I guess that's the whole Palantir protest from a few years ago. So I wanted to highlight 3 of the ways that DoD is attempting to reinvent the wheel. In Section 833, the NDAA authorizes or requires rather that DoD establish a pilot program to develop and implement unique acquisition mechanisms for emerging technologies into acquisition programs or operational use. This is requiring at least 4 new projects that support either offensive missile capability, space-based assets, personnel or quality of life improvements, or energy generation storage, or other projects as the Secretary sees fit. And DoD is tasked with developing a unique acquisition plan for each project that is, quote, significantly novel from the standard practices. And they give some examples of what that might be. It could be an alternative price evaluation model where they're looking more at, life cycle costs. It could be alternative independent cost estimate methodologies, alternative market research methods, alternative IP strategies. And as part of all of this, and it's part of the directive to put DoD's thinking cap on, they also require DoD to report back to determine if the existing authorities are adequate to continue this type of pilot program. And if not, they directly ask DoD to submit recommendations to the HASC and the SASC for statutory reforms. In another interesting aspect of this pilot program, which you'll see is reoccurring, is that it sets specific data reporting requirements and metrics. one thing that I've heard is in DoD's years of trying to procure, commercial technology and at a faster pace or through different material, is DoD lacks the data to know if, OTAs have been successful at saving the government money or getting technology to the warfighter in a faster manner. So in all of these pilot programs I'm talking about today, and really throughout the bill, you'll see a emphasis on data reporting and data collection so that future NDAs can make more intelligent policy decisions based on the data.
I feel like you answered, Kevin, my question around I was thinking, how is this different than utilizing OTAs? But you bring up a really good point, which is there's a lack of data around utilization of OTAs, and its effectiveness. And I know there have been some rumblings around probably some increased oversight we'll be seeing of OTA use and potentially reining it in, because I know that the numbers are pretty drastic, and Congress has been getting some heartburn over something they, are not necessarily controlling.
Yeah, and I mean, Lizzie, there's I think even more than rumblings. If you look at some of the other provisions in this NDAA, you have a Section 824, which requires DoD to review its use of OTAs and to recommend to Congress whether that authority should be modified or expanded or gotten rid of altogether. You also have some reporting requirements where DoD has to establish procedures to identify OTA agreements. That's Section 825. And for that provision, the Senate identified a lack of transparency, citing a DoD IG report, especially with awards to consortiums. There's just not much public visibility into who's getting them and what they're doing with them.
Well, now I'll be very interested to kind of see the results of when all of that comes in, as you said, the data that's pretty much spanning across the NDAA around this issue.
Absolutely. And, another of the pilot programs, it's one with a focus or a preference for small businesses and non-traditional contractors, tasking DoD with establishing a competitive merit-based pilot program to accelerate the procurement and fielding of innovative technologies. And what the real point of this pilot program is to eliminate the so-called valley of death, where a company comes up with innovative defense technology that there's a definite need for and a desire for, but by the time DoD goes through all the hoops and is actually able to award a large enough contract to this company after it's proven its technology works, that company is already gone out of business or is no longer on the cutting edge, and DoD kind of missed their window to use that technology or procure that technology in a timely manner. So this pilot program is hoping to cut through those issues, and again, this one has detailed data collection requirements and given DoD a year to issue guidelines for this program. So I'll be interested to see exactly what they come up with.
Definitely.
And similarly, they specifically put in another small business targeted pilot for small businesses to develop technology enhanced capabilities for special forces operations. So I think there could be some interesting benefits for some creative technology uses there as well. Some opportunities for small businesses. Now, while I found what's in this year's bill very interesting, we have a question of how is 834 different than CBER SCTR? In a way, well, first of all, DoD hasn't put a lot of explanation, and the NDAA did not give a lot of guidance into how this pilot program is going to be launched. But I think the idea is for it to be similar to SBIR is what I would expect, except faster. But the devil's always in the details, and we'll have to see how it's implemented, where I think there's as good a chance as not that it's a carbon copy of, or a slight facsimile of the SBIR program, and not this groundbreaking, innovative pilot that they're hoping it to be. But we'll see when DoD actually explains what they're thinking here.
Yeah, I'll be interested in that, because I know that Congress has been looking at reauthorizing SBIR, STTR, right? And it's something that there've been a couple hearings about, and they've been trying to figure out, what to do. So I'll be interested in, as you said, if this is kind of a carbon copy, or if there are any lessons learned or things going on in this program that can be, taken over into SBIR.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's where a lot of this data collection is coming in. I haven't heard it directly about the SBIR program, but with most of the other programs, I know that the House and Senate Armed Services Committee have both complained about a lack of data to base some of these policy decisions on, and I'd suspect that the SBIR STTR programs suffer from a similar lack of imperial data collection.
For sure.
We also have a question about, as interesting it is what is in the bill, especially with the strange way this year's bill was enacted. What got left out of the bill?
And Kevin, can I say that this next slide, just before we talk about it, gives me so much heartburn, because many of these things are things that we have, on behalf of the organizations we represent, have worked to get in, not just this NDAA, some previous NDAAs, or some moving legislation independently or in other vehicles. We have stood on our heads, gotten signatures with 1,000 companies in 24 hours for some of this stuff. So I'm triggered by this slide.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the top, the House originally passed HR 4350, and if you read anything in the fall about what's in this year's NDAA, it was likely in reference to the provisions that were in that House version. The Senate wasn't able to bring that up for a vote, and instead we had a behind closed doors pseudo compromise bill, or pseudo conference bill. It was definitely a compromise bill that ended up passing, and it omitted a lot of the provisions from HR 4350 that I was tracking, and that I know you had worked hard on. For example, there were going to be significant increases in the overall small business goals. The sole source thresholds for 8As was gonna go up by, I think, almost 50%.
That was actually the sole source thresholds for all socioeconomic programs,
right,
actually including individually owned 8A companies. The idea was to raise it from the current 4.5 and 7.5 million to 8 and 10 million. If you have heard us talk about this before, this provision did not eliminate option years. This was over the total life of the contract. Just some quick history, if you'll indulge me on this provision, that I'm sure many of the companies on this call have supported. We had worked on a bill that passed last Congress in the House that kept them at 4 and 7 million, but then allowed for eliminating, allowing that each year, right, instead of over the life of the contract. In a Senate reauthorization draft of SBA last Congress, there was this 8 and 10 million again each year. When reintroduced this year by Representatives Salazar, Newman, and Evans, so bipartisanly, out of the House. This was the provision that then made it into the House version, as Kevin said, which was 8 and 10 million over the total life of the contract. So please know that we understand that this is something that every small business cares about, and this is something that can help combat category management and get more dollars into the hands of small businesses that are innovative and can provide fantastic services for the government. So we are going to continue, as we are on the other bullets on this slide, to advocate for this change. And just because it didn't make it into this year's NDAA certainly does not mean that we have forgotten about it or stopped talking about it.
And Lizzie, go back to one of the points you made earlier. When does lobbying on these provisions to get them into the FY23 start?
It's actually starting right now. We are beginning to talk about the FY23 NDAA, what small business provisions could be in there, what that looks like, and just some, kind of insider baseball politics behind what makes it into the NDAA. It's not that most of these were not bipartisan. They were, other than the goals increase. It's that all four corners for something to make it in have to agree. Four corners meaning the chair and ranking of the both Senate and House small business committees. So Democrat, Republican in the Senate, Democrat, Republican in the House. So if there is not an agreement by all four corners, then it does not make it into the bill. So that was the problem with some of these provisions. Again, that doesn't mean that we won't keep working on them, but they just didn't make it in this year. Kevin, can I talk a little bit about the goals increase? I know that's been a hot topic.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so this was a provision that increased, as Kevin mentioned, the small disadvantage goal in a manner from the current 5% to 11% for FY 2022, then 12% for 23, 13% for FY 24, and then 15% for FY 25 and thereafter. The WSB goal from 5 to 6% for FY 22 and 23, and then 7% for FY 24 and thereafter. Hub zone for 3 to 4%, and then SDV OSB from 3 to 4%. And also the overall prime contracting small business goal from 23 to 25%. This is something that the president has talked about in reforms he put out that we were also really pumped about, that address issues with category management and other things of that nature. There was language in there that was suggesting that agencies increase goals for small disadvantaged businesses to 11%. And this is something that has to be done statutorily. So Congress has to do it. So there is no, the goals did not change, but coming from, the boss, right? The president to his federal agencies, they do take that into consideration. So I wouldn't expect this to go away. Something we've always said is there does need to be some parity, right? So you can't just increase goals for one group, others need an increase as well, which is why you saw HUBZone and SDVOSB get a 1% bump. Some weren't happy, but better than nothing. So this is something that you'll probably keep seeing the administration figure out how to tackle, since it didn't make it into the final bill.
Yeah, and Lizzie, if you missed out on or FY23 is not, what other bills or policy things are coming up that we may be able to influence, or there may be opportunities for that government contractors should be watching out for?
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, I know we're almost out of time, so I'm just gonna do a very abbreviated version of this. The most important thing for government contractors is government funding, if you kind of get down to the core of it, right? The current continuing resolution funds the government that expires on February 18th. The reason that continuing resolutions, which is funding the government at previous fiscal year level, is such a problem for government contractors is a CR means there are no new starts, grants. If you had expanded work, that's not happening. Agencies are just going to keep issuing bridge contracts. So, you know, we see continuing resolutions. It's become a norm, but we're really pressuring Congress for that not to be a norm because it has such huge impacts on agencies. Something like, you know, the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed. Agencies are trying to develop plans and implement programs in the bill. I know that the Federal Transit Administration is trying to figure out their rollout right now. And most programs in that bill have a timetable of about 180 days to a year. You know, that can't get fully started until there is additional appropriations, because, you know, some of that part of that bill relied on appropriations for FY22 that were in those appropriations bills, you know, to get it rolling. So that's something that, you know, you should keep your pulse on, important to your contracts. It looks like appropriators are resuming negotiations on the FY 2022 spending bills today. Talking about this week, there was just a hearing in the House on how horrible full year continuing resolutions are on DoD. So contractors are not the only ones saying this. Agencies are feeling the pain as well. So we'll see where that goes. There have been discussions around a year-long continuing resolution. That's not off the table, but I think that the appropriators and leadership in both the House and Senate are getting some pressure on why they need to actually pass those bills for the remainder of FY 2022. And then I know, Kevin, I have a couple other things, but I know we're out of time. But I would just say, you know, PilieroMazza puts out some fantastic information on what, you know, is going on and recapping. I would encourage you to, you know, take a look at their client alerts and their LinkedIn. They go way more in depth in their analysis than things that we write about. If you're looking for, you know, kind of what's going on, the politics behind it, I would encourage you to check out our LinkedIn as well. But thank you so much for joining us. And Kevin, I'm going to turn it back to you on that.
All right. Well, I think we're out of time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your great questions. And if you asked a question and we didn't get back to you, we'll try and email you with a response. But let us know if you have any questions, or if there's any way that Lizzie or I could help you implement these provisions, or, you know, influence future provisions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.